from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. You are worthy of it all. You are worthy of it all. All the saints and angels, they bow before your throne. And all the elders cast their crowns before the Lamb of God and say, you are worthy of it all. You are worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. For the last time, you are worthy.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's my privilege to be with you here this evening and to give this 35th AIGS lecture series. As my colleague rightly introduced me, I had studied with your Professor Sanguk as colleagues at Westminster Theological Seminary. And it pleased the Lord for me to have served him in the capacities mentioned, and I've taught in different parts of the world. And I'm here with you to share. In fact, at the time of the worship, as you can see from the introduction, I am a pastor, I'm a teacher, and I'm a preacher. So when the worship was going on, I felt this should really be a preaching time, but I'll still deliver my lecture. This particular topic, why it has its basis in Nigeria, I think the themes are relevant in any place where people are interested in missions. And as this school, from its origin, being birthed towards the evangelization of the world, particularly in Asia, but it's gone really global. And Korea as a nation, Christian church in Korea is heavily invested in missions. Some of you who were at Lausanne would have heard, right now, Korea is the second largest missionary sending nation. And with that, it's important to understand mistakes that other missionaries had made so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. We may not be perfect, but yesterday, from one of your faculty, I got a good analogy about mistakes that missionaries make. When you go and you are not careful, you can be like chicken dung. If it's very fresh, it can destroy crops. But when it stays over a long time, it fertilizes the crops and makes them very fruitful. So I think this lecture will go a long way in preparing those of you who may be ministering cross-culturally so that you will not be like fresh chicken coop that will destroy the crops, but one that has been matured that can bless. Years ago in Africa, there was a mission that sent a missionary to this community. And after some time, people from the headquarters came to visit the missionary, and they wanted to do an assessment based on what the locals felt. And you know, Africans sometimes would not want to shame a visitor. So as they were asking them how the missionary was doing, everybody was kind of quiet. And some would say nice things, but the headquarters people were not convinced. As they kept asking, one elder stood up and said, well, we love our missionary. He's very helpful. He does many things, but there's one thing. He's always answering questions that nobody's asking. So when we are not contextual, we will be answering questions that nobody is asking. So that's why a topic like this is very important. So I'll try to read the paper and maybe stop at some points to explain, as the topic is the ramifications of missionary proselytization on the thief culture, lessons for biblical contextualization. As you may not know, but Nigeria has over approximately 220 million people, roughly about 1/5 of Africa's population. And we have a very fair share of Babel, many languages, over 400 ethnic groups, each with their languages. So Tiv is one of the ethnic groups, not one of the major ones, but it's not too small either. It makes up about 5% of Nigeria's population. But today I decided to dress in national colors. If you watch soccer, you see green and white here. Anyway, so the Tiv people were evangelized first by the Dutch Christian Reform Mission from South Africa. And then the Catholic Church came, and then later other missions. So I will talk a little bit about what the Dutch Reform and the Catholics were doing, and then we see where there were mistakes and how we can be more biblically contextual. The concern for communicating the gospel in terms relevant to recipient cultures is not a modern one, dating back to the apostolic times, as we see Paul's sermon on the Areopagus in Acts 17. In extra-biblical literature, evidence of this is found in writings as far back as the times of the apostolic and post-apostolic church fathers. The references there, references we can check. That the missionary endeavors of the past, of the post-Enlightenment modern time mission has a huge impact on African and particularly Nigerian cultures needs no proving. Yet evidence abounds that traditional religion is alive and doing well, with many adherents of scriptural religions, whether Christianity or Islam, continuing to patronize the African indigenous religions, AIRs. Concerning the undying presence of AIR in the Nigerian landscape, David Adeyomo observes, and I quote, AIR has become an essential element of indigenous knowledge systems. Several steps have been taken by health workers and parliament to give recognition to African indigenous healers, end of quote. Bascom and Heskovitz capture the essence of this very, very well when they note, and I quote, despite the intensity of Christian missionary effort and thousand years of Muslim proselytizing, which have marked the various parts of Africa, African religions continue to manifest vitality everywhere. This is to be seen in the worship of African deities, the homage to ancestors, and recourse to divination, magic, and other rituals, end of quote. Part of what they are saying here is the fact that in spite of people believing religions like Christianity and Islam, at moments of crisis, people often resort to the traditional methods of consulting with magicians or mullahs and other traditional systems. All this points to gaps in the inherited revealed religions as being practiced by African peoples. It is in recognition of these gaps in contemporary Christianity that there is a growing inquiry into inculturation as a possible remedy for the evangelization and traditioning practices of missionary Christianity and its successors in Africa. The thesis of this paper is that the twofold goal of the Christian missionaries of proselytizing and evangelizing the Tiv people of central Nigeria succeeded in radically altering the people's culture at the ethnic or surface level without altering the mindset of the church at the emic or deeper level. We therefore set out here to examine the practices and successes or otherwise of early missionaries and used this as a springboard to propose approaches to a biblical contextualization of Christianity in contemporary society, with the hope that such could be applied elsewhere as well. And this is in the light of known research practices, where you begin with a historical moment in a local particular place with the aim of generalizing. So let's try to understand what enculturation is. Attempts at domesticating the Christian religion into local African cultures have been called by different names at different times in the last 100 years. Indigenization was the term that gained currency amongst Protestant missions around the middle of the 20th century. The rise of missiological concept of contextualization is traceable to the 1971 World Council of Churches consultation on dogmatic or contextual theology. The nudging from these consultations were picked up and developed further in 1972 to 73 conference of the Committee of World Missions on Evangelization of the World Council of Churches, which was critical of theological imperialism, with the outcome that non-Western churches were being urged to replace their understanding of the gospel and their work with God in the theology, a liturgy, and a praxis, and a form of community rooted in their own culture. The chief proponent of the term was Shoki Koi, the then Director General of World Council of Churches Theological Education Fund. By the time of the first Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization in 1974, contextualization was beginning to replace indigenization. Expanding on the 1974 Lausanne conception of the term, Biancato states, and I quote, "This is a new term imported into theology to express a deeper concept than indigenization ever does. We understand the term to mean making concepts or ideas relevant in a given situation. In reference to Christian practices, it is an effort to express the never-changing word of God in ever-changing modes of relevance. Since the gospel message is inspired by the mold of its expression, but the mold of its expression is not. Contextualization of the modes of expression is not only right, but necessary," end of quote. In the fullness of its reference, the term encompasses the understanding, conceptualization, and communication of the gospel in terms and forms that are cognizant of and in dialogue with the prevailing cultural, sociological, technological, and socioeconomic, the human justice, spiritual conditions of the people being reached. I am fully aware that this full-up conception of the term is understood and implemented differently, contingent on where one stands on the liberal conservative continuum of the church. But we do not have the luxury of time and space to fully explore that here. Now, in the footnote, you will see some of the issues that I raised concerning how liberals would view contextualization, conservatives would view contextualization, and the in-between. According to Clement Eoliam, the Catholic mission had used the term adaptation, similar to the Protestant term of indigenization, in reference to evangelization approach. Explaining further, he states, and I quote, "Adaptation suggests a situation whereby a foreign missionary announces the gospel message to suit the circumstances of the receiving culture. Faith adapts or accommodates itself in a limited fashion to the exigencies of cultural expression for the sake of communication of the gospel or of the message," end of quote. So, like the Protestant term indigenization, adaptation held sway amongst the Catholics from the middle of the 20th century to 1974, and it's very similar, and both in terms of timing. To the 1974 Roman Synod on Evangelization, just as the Christians were having the Lausanne Congress on Evangelization. As a counterpart term to the Protestant, contextualization, enculturation was first coined by Joseph Masson in 1974, introduced to the Synod of Bishops in 1977 by Padre Arupe, Superior General of the Jesuits Order. It was the use of the term by Pope John Paul II in 1979 that popularized it in missiological and scholarly parlance. Enculturation goes beyond just external aesthetics dressing of the gospel in cultural garbs, as adaptation was. Explaining enculturation further, William states, and I quote, "It signifies an interior transformation of authentic cultural values through their integration into Christianity and the rooting of Christianity into various human cultures. It has the advantage of echoing the concept of incarnation, while at the same time emphasizing the importance of culture and lifting up the relationship of faith and cultures as an ongoing process rather than a once-for-all encounter." The process of enculturation involves a metamorphosis of a culture's values in that culture's encounter with Christianity vis-à-vis the rooting of Christianity itself in its host culture. The dynamic interplay between theology and culture draws on the tools of anthropology in the attempts at understanding culture. Through ethnographic studies, one acquires competence in the symbolisms and cultural knowledge of a people as the avenues through which one finds appropriately meaningful cultural ways of expressing one's faith such that it connects with a people's heart. At the theological level, the implication of enculturation is that the Christian message, not just its external wrappings, need to take flesh, become incarnate in the patterns of thought, language, and symbolisms of a particular culture. Like a tree that cannot bear fruit unless it takes root in the soil where it has been planted, so too faith needs to be planted and contextualized in the culture where it takes root so that it can bring forth fruit. To do this, faith needs to dialogue with the culture wherein it is contextualized. This process calls upon the preacher to develop dual competencies in theology and local cultures. Now, let me pause here to draw a little bit of a distinction between enculturation as the Catholic conceive it and contextualization as Protestants see it. I think the quote from Biancato highlights that well. The message of the cross is unchangeable, but the forms of expression change with changing from culture to culture over time. But what enculturation says is that Christianity itself needs to change to suit a culture. So it's not just the expression, but even the message can also vary. There are two assumptions in enculturation that raise concerns for evangelicals. First, undergirding it is the anthropological assumption of goodness of the human person. This flies in the face of the Reformation doctrine of the total depravity of the human person, which is informed by such scriptural passages as listed here. Whither then can human goodness be found? Notwithstanding, evangelical doctrine still teaches that the imago Dei remains in humanity, marred as it is, not destroyed. This, coupled with the understanding that common grace ensures the presence of some non-redemptive good, not comprehensively wholesome goodness, is still present in human culture. Second assumption, which follows from the first, is that the seed of the word is present in every culture. At face value, this assumption sounds like the evangelical concept of redemptive analogies. However, there are marked differences. Redemptive analogies imply that embedded in every culture are echoes of divine truth that point humanity to God's revealed truth. But only the latter, that is the revealed truth, is redemptive. The former merely serves as a springboard in general revelation, connecting the culture to the truth. In enculturation, the Catholic form, however, the presence of the seed of the word in culture implies the very presence of Christ already existing in culture, say African culture, and the missionaries are not his purveyors to Africa. This claim implies that the totality of the Christian doctrine not just its externalities, needs assume the pattern of thoughts, language, and symbols of a particular culture. The implication of this is that Christianity would become accommodated to the worldview of the host culture. The foregoing discussion highlights the danger of syncretism lurking in pure inculturation. It has to be approached with the full understanding that Christianity comes with a view of redeeming culture it encounters and imbuing it with a biblical worldview. Notwithstanding, nothing could be further from the truth than to assume that Christ is already present in every culture with the whole body of the Christian message, and is not brought there by any missionary. Now, here, as you study missions, you will come across what I may call the three major approaches that people take to the issue of Christ's relation to culture. Some of the missionaries I'm discussing their approaches here would come from the first group, whereby everything in culture is bad, Christ against culture. And at that time, because, say, for example, musical instruments were used in African worship of pagan gods, so all of that was condemned as bad. So no drums, nothing from the African perspective would be relevant. The other extreme, which would be almost like what the Catholics would advocate, Christ in culture. Christ is subsumed in culture. And therefore, whatever the culture is doing becomes adopted. Again, that's generally not the right way. So there's a middle course of Christ redeeming culture. Christ comes into a culture, and all the good things about the culture are retained, but those elements that are detrimental to human life itself or to humanity and the Word of God in particular need to be filled with new content. So in discussing, we will look at that earlier. So in this regard, Tushima cautions, quote from one of my other publications, the core of the whole idea of proclamation is the concept of communication. Affirming oneself as a communicator presupposes a message, a content, that one wishes to transmit. For the gospel proclaimer, the content is the good news of the vicarious salvific work of Jesus of Nazareth in his life, death, and resurrection. And you can never replace that. Within the redemptive historical context of the Christian Bible, gospel proclaimers in the new world of the postmodern mindset, with its aversion to absolutes and incredulity to meta-narratives, must remain committed to the absolutes of the biblical truths and its meta-narrative of redemptive history. It is only out of this commitment that true proclamation of the gospel will emerge. Otherwise, we'll be proclaiming something not of Jesus, which will not be gospel at all. End of quote. In view of this huge divergence of perspectives, I would rather that Protestants stick with the term contextualization. If we are to use inculturation, then it has to be redefined in a way that it does not call on us to surrender the truth of Scripture for a good in culture. Such a reconceived inculturation will acknowledge that every culture has customs or practices that are analogous to and point to biblical truth, and these should be pressed into service as vehicles and vehicles only for conveying the truth of Scripture to the culture. Thus, for example, Don Richardson's Peace Child in Papua New Guinea points to the Prince of Peace, God's peace child. But the Papuan peace child is not Christ himself. That Christianity needs to be in continual dialogue with culture is not in doubt. But Christianity cannot assume the thinking patterns, worldview of local cultures. It can, and as has been done previously, creatively take appropriate symbols and language forms of culture and fill them with new meaning for effective communication of biblical truths, as the Apostle Paul did, for example, with the unknown God in Acts 17. So, with this background, let's now go into looking at how the early missionaries carried on in northern Nigeria. 4 major mission agencies with significant work in northern Nigeria were the Catholic Mission, the Church Missionary Society, CMS, the Sudan United Mission, SUM, which was made up of different missions that the Dutch Christian Reformed Church Mission was part of. And then later on, what became the Sudan Interior Mission, where these were some of the key missionary agencies at the beginning, from the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. The work of CMS, which began in southern Nigeria by the middle of the 19th century, gradually moved into the north at the turn of the 20th century. The Society of African Missions of the French province of the Catholic Church commenced work in northern Nigeria in 1907 in Shendam amongst the Gomai at the direction of the colonial administration of Major U.F. Roxton. The individual independent mission efforts that became SIM were begun in 1893 with heavy casualties. SIM missionary presence began to have a foothold after 1910. SUM work commenced in 1911. The SUM was an umbrella body for different mission endeavors, not the least the Dutch Reformed Church Mission, DRCM, that worked amongst the TIF. The approaches of both Catholic and Protestant missions had similarities and differences. The greatest difference between them was that whereas the Catholic missionaries worked in alliance with the colonial administrators and received a lot of patronage and material support from the latter, the Protestant missions tended to work at odds with the colonial administration, thereby incurring the latter's wrath. For example, while the Catholic mission told the colonial government's directive on civilizing missions and staying out of Muslim enclaves, the Protestant missions focused on itinerant preaching and continued to pressure governments for full access to all areas for evangelization. Now, what I'm saying here is that whereas the colonial administration had wanted the missions to focus only on things like education so as to get the benighted Africans, as they called them, to be more civilized. And so the Catholic Church, their mission that began work tended to follow what government says, whereas the Protestant missions were more interested in winning souls to Christ. Similarly, in order to pacify, before the colonial times, northern Nigeria had undergone a jihad from Muslims that forcibly converted a number of people in the northern extreme north to Islam. And so there was an Islamic caliphate. Whereas the southern parts of Nigeria were more pagans. And so the colonial administration directed Christian missionaries, stay within pagan areas, don't enter into the Islamic areas. And the Catholics will follow that strictly. Whereas the Protestants want to go everywhere and share the gospel. Both Catholic and Protestant were keen on spreading their influence and winning converts. Their divergent approaches resulted in the Catholic mission restricting itself to urban areas and serving southern immigrant population, while the Protestants spread and covered many of the pagan areas of the north. From the 1930s, when the colonial government introduced the concept of classes of religious instruction, the Catholics latched on it, and with increasing desire of the local populations for Western education, which the Protestants were not providing, the Catholics were able to play catch-up with the Protestants in their spread in the rural areas. It was only the success of the Catholics that pushed the Protestants to embrace inclusion of a robust educational curriculum in their evangelization programs, beginning with the CRIs in the 1940s. From the 1950s onwards, schools, together with medical services, had become the important tool of mission work for both Catholics and Protestant missions. So again, here just to explain, like I hinted earlier on, when the Protestants were there before the Catholics, but were only giving very rudimentary education for people to be able to read the Bible in their local languages. While the colonial administration was growing and there was need for manpower, but people who were passing through the Protestant mission were not getting the qualification to be employed in the colonial administration. Whereas the Catholics were giving a fuller education, English language, all subjects, mathematics, and therefore as they opened their schools, more people were going there because they knew when they pass out, they will also get jobs with the colonial administration. So it was that drawing of the Catholics attracting more people that now forced the Protestant missions to also embrace fuller education. And part of it is like amongst the thieves, they were first evangelized by the Dutch Christian Reformed Church from South Africa. Remember, they were coming out of an apartheid system. And so that influenced the way they were carrying out their mission, whereby they thought black people to be inferior, and therefore there was no need to give them full education. So that limited what they were doing in that regard. Outreach approaches of the missionaries. As highlighted above, from the beginning, the Protestants had focused on itinerant preaching amongst the pagan societies with reported growing numbers of converts. The Catholics initially employed agriculture at Gomai Station and the care of Southern Catholic immigrants. Now, when you hear about Southern Catholic immigrants, Western civilization came by the sea to the south, and the more inland you went, the more difficult it was to travel. So the Western influence in the north was not present until much, much later from the 30s and 40s. And so a lot of the workforce that was needed by the colonial administration was coming from people from the south, who right from the middle of the 18th century were already beginning to go to school. So the Catholic mission, as they were focusing in urban areas, initially they were focused on these southerners who were coming, taking care of them so that they will in turn reach out to the other natives. So that's the situation. Though the colonial administration and missionaries had different goals of civilizing the savages and evangelizing the heathen respectively, they found a common confluence in the CRI program. Again, classes for religious instruction was a colonial administration program. They saw it as something that would encourage missionaries to actively work to provide education for the masses of the people that they could not. Now, because the word religious was included, it now gave room for the missionaries to also bring in their own agenda of evangelization. It both introduced and spread facets of Western civilization and opened doors for evangelization of the North. The Catholics were savvy in their mission approach. They chose the path of least resistance to government, initially at least, as Monsignor Walla, the first prefect of the Eastern Prefecture, reportedly used to say that survival was the first order of life. As a consequence of towing government lines, they latched onto the CRI policy early, which yielded heavy dividends of government patronage and the ability to capture the attention of the natives and make proselytes, as they were enticed by the prospect of acquiring Western education with the possibility of the attendant new economic status. Similarly, they were less strict on moral issues like alcoholism. All this led to the rapid growth of the Catholic mission from the 1930s. So the Catholics were less relaxed in terms of morals. You can drink your alcohol, while the Protestants were very strict. Or for the Catholics, if you have many wives, you can choose one and wed that one. Then they will keep a blind eye to all the others. They don't exist. So Africans as polygamists would love that. Whereas the Protestant will say you send away all your wives and leave the first one, which was very difficult for many families. That's a different topic of its own. The Protestant missions from very early focused on itinerant evangelism. Baba Panya, writing on this with regards to SIM notes, and I quote, "Once the SIM established a base, their goal had been to spread out and establish mission stations over a wide territory as possible. Then from each station, they trekked to village after village, sharing the gospel." End of quote. Key to their work was to quickly prepare new converts to become evangelists themselves, outlining the evangelistic approach of the SIM, which was typical of the Protestant missions. Baba states, and I quote, The basic method of the early missionaries, SIM missionaries, consisted of literacy, basic Bible teaching, and apprenticeship. Classes were held several times a week. Sundays were strictly for worship service, baptismal classes, Bible studies, and gospel team ministries. During baptismal classes, they taught Bible and doctrine. A pattern of evangelism was established, and the new believers were taught right from the beginning to go out and share their knowledge of salvation through Jesus Christ and their relatives and with their relatives and neighbors and with those in nearby villages. End of quote. Barnes points out that Protestant missions tended to wage war against traditions, customs, culture, and the cultures of indigenous peoples of northern Nigeria. He then concludes that such preaching did not motivate many people to become Christians. He illustrates the Protestant mission war against culture with DRCM's fight against exchange marriages amongst the Tiv people. Now, what he means here by exchange marriage is that, mark you, before the coming of Westerners, many places in Africa were using trade by barter. There were no currencies. And so amongst the Tiv people, even marriage was done by barter. So for example, if I have a son that needs to get married, and then Professor Songkok has a daughter that needs to marry, then I will take my son so that he will have his daughter, but then his own son, I will also find my relative to marry, so that there was an exchange between us. So it was called exchange marriage. So by the time the missionaries came, they found it very odd. And they used combined with the colonial administration to use force to force the peoples to stop that kind of marriage system. The outcomes of mission work. From the above historical survey of the missionary endeavors of both Catholic and Protestant mission, basic inferences could be drawn. First, early missionary work focused on gaining converts. That's the process of proselytization. The inherent competition for converts between Catholics and Protestants ineluctably tilted the scales in favor of the drive for numerical growth and occupation of large spans of territory. Little efforts were expended in the understanding of local cultures and their inherent worldviews. Consequently, there was little dialogue between the evading Christian faith and native cultures. Dark airs of suspicion beclouded the ensuing acculturation of missionaries with locals. The former perceived native cultures as benighted and needed to be changed, while the latter looked upon the new ways as the spoiling of better established ways that provided harmony, equilibrium, and stability to their cosmos. So we do a sampling of negative Protestant mission outcomes. As a consequence of the misunderstanding of native cultures as mentioned above, there was an aggressive move, especially amongst Protestant missions, to change native cultural practices. A case in point is the exchange marriage system among the Tiv of central Nigeria that was fought to extinction in 1927 by the combined forces of colonialists and the Dutch Reformed Church Mission. Cheered by Tiv youth, youth always are the age of change, right? So when that came, they were very happy. Similarly, the DRCM, working in cahoots with the colonial administration, employed the youth as thugs to force the elders of Tiv land to abandon wizardry and to surrender their wizardry crafts in the 1920s. You don't change culture by force. But that was what the mission was doing, using colonial power to force people, okay, witchcraft is bad, you must stop it. And if any elders will not surrender, that they were beaten to pulp. So, American anthropologist Eugene Rubins, over half a century ago, laid the charge that Western society missions and the colonial administration synergized and, quote, cooperated in demolishing the satanic structure, as they thought, in thief culture because it was considered pagan. He keenly noted the changes that modernity has brought has forced the capitulation of thief attitude towards change itself. With its demise, the structure of thief thought has been irrevocably altered. The changes imposed from without by colonial government, by business enterprise, by missions, by newspapers are now forcing the collapse of a venerable society. The old, to be sure, was never idyllic, yet the Westerner was can scarcely assert that his product shows a great cultural superiority. End of quote. As the combination of a brutal colonial administration, Christian mission, and a tantalizing Western civilization eroded the binding elements of thief culture, it inexorably collapsed gradually. The new converts to Christianity, however, lacked depth. Indeed, there emerged a large number of secularizing local population that no longer dreaded the taboos of traditional fetish religion, but were not bound by the ethics and boundaries of the new religion. Rubens insightfully identifies this vacuum as he wrote, quote, "For those who cast off the fetish but do not turn to Christ and their legion, a spiritual and cultural vacuum opens wide." End of quote. The consequence of this was and continues to be very devastating both for the general cohesion of thief society as well as for its morality. One example of rite of passage will suffice, so we've turned to that. In traditional thief culture, morality was highly prized. The virginity of females in particular was not taken lightly. Thus, once a female child was weaned, she was initiated into the cult of the single spirit, a combined banjo, and its symbol, typically the shell of a small snail, Ikor, would be tied around the neck like a necklace of the girl. When the girl reached marriageable age and a suitor came for dowry payment, one of the requirements was to bring a young she-goat that had not yet given birth. If you recall, then there would be a cleansing rite of passage, the removal of the singleness bond, during which the symbol of the single spirit would be removed from her neck and she would be handed over to her husband. It was believed that as long as she carried that symbol, any man that slept with her would become impotent. This way, purity was maintained. There was a variant to this practice amongst two thief clans, the Heriv and Massive. They used to practice Ikar Iyan, kind of an officially sanctioned boyfriend dating relationship that included sexual relations as an assurance for the future. So for those two clans, before a lady would get married, the parents and the culture allowed it in their own enclave, whereby the girl will have somebody who is close by as a boyfriend. In fact, in most cases, the lady will be pregnant before she will get married, just in case the new husband is not able to impregnate her. And it was also some kind of assurance for them that if the husband is bad to her, she can come back. There's somebody here waiting for her. Anyway, so that was a variant for a subsect. This boyfriend was called Ikea, or friend. Before marriage, she would need to undergo cleansing rite for purification called Iye, that is the cleansing bath for their combo she violated with her calf. Before marriage would ensure to save the childbearing subsequently. Now, the practice of cleansing rite for the Akombo Asa and Iye converged at one point. So this small subset, as well as the larger thief culture, all practice the cleansing rite, where before the girl will be given out in marriage, she will be cleansed, so that commitment to singleness will not follow her. So whether that small subset that allowed boyfriend and sexual relations, or the larger thief society that held up to purity, they will still cleanse her, so that that spirit that was watching over singles will now be made to leave her, so that she can freely enjoy her marriage. There is in the table there the recitation that the woman who was performing the rite of washing would say. So, as the girl was being purified or cleansed, the woman would say, "Ibioshen ishokondo." You can see the translation: guilt descend, right standing ascend. Guilt descend, right standing ascend. The sun for the male child, the moon for the female child. I am not a copycat. You are being cleansed today by all the ritual cosmic powers of Tiv. So basically, what can see some, as I mentioned, issues of redemptive analogies. This ritual performance, talking about guilt going down, there will be a sacrifice, quite all right. And by the blood of that sacrifice, it carrying away the guilt. And then right standing, from the Christian standpoint, right standing is not what you earn, but you are granted. So there was that concept. And so the pronouncement, the sun for the male child, the moon for the female child, was already pronouncing fertility for this young girl. She will have both sons and daughters. And then the person doing the ritual is asserting, I'm not just a copycat, I have powers to do this, and I'm summoning all the cosmic powers of Tiv to purify you. That's the concept there. The efficacy of this cleansing rite was twofold. First, to cleanse the young lady from the fetish and mysterious forces of a combo that may have been previously placed on her. Second, it served to secure her progeny. While the generative practice aimed at preventing any premarital sex, the massive and hairy subgroup, understanding the restiveness of the adolescent age bracket, allowed a teenage girl to have a foretaste of what sex life is like in only one committed relationship to a male near her home for security. Both pure virgins of the majority of Tiv people and the dated ladies of massive hairy extraction underwent this cleansing rite of passage before marriage. Western missionaries discountenanced both. The Protestant mission in particular actively crusaded against African traditions such that all cultural practices were considered satanic and had to be fought against without understanding the underlying philosophy and morality, as well as the functions they served in preserving the community. Without that knowledge, there was no deliberate effort to fill the vacuum created by elimination of all fetish practices. By the time all forms of restraint were removed, the floodgates for all forms of perfidy and promiscuity in society were flung open. It is stating the obvious to say that the cultural practices of every people group have overarching goals towards which they are striving in accordance with their values. When alien values are superimposed on a native culture without paying attention to their subversion of the culture that gives the people their sense of identity, security, and solidarity, it renders them ruthless and makes for social disintegration. Rubens, while writing in the early 60s, bemoaned the disintegration of the hitherto closely knit Tiv society, held together by the tripartite pillars of Aondo, which is God, Tsav, witchcraft, and Ta, the realm of the people, as traditional ways were being fast replaced by the imported Western virtues shown. He insightfully states, and I quote, "Today, from thousands of compounds, the young march off to school to learn science that defies the fetishes of old society and religion that displaces the fear of magical malevolence. For those who cast off the fetish but do not turn to Christ, they are legion, a spiritual and cultural volume opens wide. If Tsav is but a fiction and there is no such potency to be reverenced, there is little further rationale for respect to the elders, and that respect has indeed declined. if the tie is not spoiled after all by the violation of a taboo, then whatever barriers to morality exist dissolve. Rubens well understood the wreckage that this forced change was bringing. So with regards to the case of virgins cited above, once the taboo was unmasked, the genie was let out of the box, and the restive youth now felt free to explore to the fullest the features and thrills of their sexuality, flowing from the surging tides that hormonal changes of puberty and adolescent years bring. A sampling of negative Catholic mission outcomes. While the Protestant mission had truly, to its name, been against government, Islam, and traditions of Africa, the Catholic mission avidly allied itself with the colonial government, becoming almost like its appendage. The poorly supported staff of the French Province Missionary Society of Africa came on stream in 1907 and was recognized as the Apostolic Prefecture of Eastern Nigeria, even though it was largely in northern Nigeria. And when their work was taken over by the Irish Catholic Mission in 1929, it was appropriately renamed the Prefecture of Northern Nigeria. The first 20 years of the mission in northern Nigeria saw very little progress, as it limited itself to the dictates of the colonial administration with its attendant benefits. Barnes aptly captures this as he observed. The Catholic mission profited by the battles between colonial administration and the Protestant missionaries, becoming to administrators, if not a modern mission, at least on that they point to it as realizing the ideas of how a mission could best serve the region. These ideas were remarkably medieval. In its first incarnation, the Catholic mission, like some 20th century frontier abbey, served as the agricultural extension service and dispensary and a hostel for travelers going to and from Nigeria's northern and southern cities. So, in following the colonial administration's suggestion of engaging in civilizing mission among the Gomai in Shendam, the Catholic missionaries in turn received patronage from the colonialists, who supplied them with farm inputs and purchased fresh produce from them. At the outbreak of smallpox in 1914, the mission again received vaccination supplies from the government. Likewise, during the Mantor Rebellion against colonial taxation, the colonialists used Shendam mission as their staging center to fight the local people. This further alienated the mission from the people. Even the boys recovered from slave merchants whom the colonial administration sent to the mission, only a few accepted baptism. In the first 10 years, 25 out of the 34 baptized were those at the verge of dying from disease. Like the Protestant missionaries, the first leader of this mission, Monsignor Wale, opposed evangelization through quality education on the belief that all education produced was Africans full of pride and eager for material gain. The management of the Eastern Nigeria Prefecture by French was poor and ineffective, leaving the mission with little progress and a number of problems. One good example was their policy shift in the late 20s from a focus on government direct civilizing mission amongst traditionalists to spiritual nourishment of Southern Catholic who were migrating north to work in colonial administration or for new business opportunities. For the southern Nigerian transplants to the northern cities, the church built schools and churches, whereas nothing of such was done in the rural areas where they had been working with natives. While they spoke disparagingly of northern traditionalists as naked cannibals, some of whom could not even count up to 10, they spoke glowingly of the Southern Catholic transplant to the north, even using terms of endearment to describe them as our people who are intelligent and enterprising. This inadvertently sowed the seed of discord in the nascent church, with the Southerners having airs of superiority over their northern brothers, and a sense of resentment and suspicion developed in northern Christians towards Southerners. These ills have persisted in our midst to this very day. So the church, in a way, sowed the seed of division, even amongst Christians between northerners and southerners. The inability of the French to manage the mission effectively made Rome to transfer it to the Irish province in 1929. And it was from this time on that the Catholic Church began to experience dynamic changes that led to its phenomenal growth. This change of guards could not have occurred at a more auspicious time, as the colonial administration had just come up with a new civilizing mission policy of classes for religious instruction, CRI. The departure of Monsignor Waller made the establishment of schools possible, even though the government prohibited the use of southern educated Catholics as teachers in school in non-Muslim northern areas. The missionaries immediately set about raising teacher catechists amongst their converts. This gave further impetus to the growth of the work. While Protestants, in their characteristic anti-government stance, dragged their feet on implementing the policy, the new leadership of the Catholic mission latched on it with alacrity, giving it leverage over the Protestant missions, even in areas where they had presence for over a decade. Albert Ogizi and Lawrence Ochoa, for example, insightfully note, quote, "The Dutch Reformed Church working in Cleveland lost many of its converts to the Roman Catholic Church because the Roman Catholic preferred to have a curriculum which met the express demand of the people for a full literary education that would afford employment in government and commercial firms. It was only the amazing success of the Catholics that forced the Protestant mission to start introducing a full educational curriculum beyond vernacular literacy in their mission work. In playing catch up to the Protestant mission, the adaptation evangelization policy of the Catholic Church came handy. Rather than fight the traditions of the people headlong, the Church adopted a more nuanced approach. For example, there was no prohibition of drinking, and polygamists were not asked to divorce all their wives except one. Neither were there inquisitions into fetish practices. Neither were there inquisitions into fetish practices of the indigenous peoples. This approach made the people feel more welcome to the Catholic mission than in the Protestant mission churches, and within a short time, throngs of people were trooping into Catholic churches. While the Protestants sought to uproot their converts from their culture and tradition, leaving them with little sense of rootedness, the Catholics mounted the new belief system on the old ways, resulting in some form of syncretism. Both are problematic. The core worldview of the adherents to the two broad forms of Christianity in Nigeria have remained at core traditional, hence the lack of depth in professed faith. It is little wonder that with all of the scores of millions who flock to churches on Sundays, the impact of the church on public morality and ethics is almost invisible, if not largely negative. So, without contextualization. So long as the church continues to exist and engage local cultures, whether by indigenous believers or by cross-cultural missionaries, the gospel will continue to engage culture. How that engagement proceeds is critical to its outcome. Indeed, the church in Africa has come of age and needs to reconceptualize the gospel contextually. In view of the foregoing, I set out here to make proposals for how that engagement could proceed in ways that ensure that the gospel incarnates in the host culture without surrendering its truth values. The step proposed here would aid the gospel proclaimer to ensure that the gospel takes root in the culture, ceases to be alien, and yet retains its truth claims, that also critique the culture at junctures where it is unhelpful, unjust, or oppressive. This way, the gospel will be a liberating agent within culture, not only with regards to spiritual strongholds, but also in the social, economic, and where necessary, in the political arena as well. First, contextualization must be understood clearly. In view of the above discussion, I am persuaded of Engel's definition of contextualization. that is, showing the whole Bible relevant to the total individual in all its relationships of life. With this understanding, gospel outreach ceases to be a one-track mission of converting souls and readying them to heaven for heaven. Rather, it encompasses the regeneration and spiritual nurture of individuals, the experience of a positive influence oozing from the converts' union with Christ on their families and communities, and the planting of New Testament patterned worship assemblies with a band of converts, and such worship communities then reaching out to the larger society, proclaiming the whole truth of the Bible and addressing the total person with respect to the issues and challenges they face in all their relationships within their community. Second, the duality of contextuality must be maintained. By this I mean that the gospel we proclaim must incarnate into its host culture, reasonably appropriating the culture's critical elements of cultural knowledge, customs, values, and institutions that do not contradict the scriptures, while at the same time being allowed to work like leaven to redeem the culture through critical engagement to help it rid itself of components that are immersed in human fallibility, that end up negating human good, often being unjust and oppressive, and ineluctably subverting the divine creative and redemptive purposes. Third, the major task of contextualization then is hermeneutical in nature and executed in service of understanding on the path towards attainment of a new self-understanding. It calls for the epistemic duality of understanding of the Word of God, special revelation, and the world of God, general revelation. This, on its own part, is pursued in addressing these seven hermeneutical questions of what, from whom, to whom, where, when, why, and how. The what question is critical and most fundamental to gospel communication. It addresses the matter of what is to be communicated. Compromise here compromises the mission. The gospel communicator must therefore understand the truth of Scripture that he is commissioned to take to the ends of the world. This entails understanding the biblical text as it would have been understood by its first hearers, within its context and in accordance with its literary genre, and as it has been understood by the church through time, bearing in mind the context of contemporary readers and their hearers. From whom question relates to issues of hermeneutical self-consciousness. The gospel communicator necessarily needs to attain a good self-understanding. Where is she coming from? From what culture? With what underlying worldview and what attendant baggage? She also needs to be conscious of her location in her journey of faith, what presuppositions dominate her frame of thought, and as such intentionally thinking through how she could minimize the imposition of her worldview on others. The to whom question is an invitation to understand the target audience, its culture, its demographic composition, and the dominant issues of its existence. Gaining this knowledge is essential to answering the questions this population is asking, i.e. scratching it where it itches. Remember the story I told you at the beginning, where the local culture was assessing their missionary and they say he's always answering questions nobody is asking, because he never stopped to understand to whom he was ministering. With respect to the demographic composition, we must be cognizant of the differences concomitant with income levels, educational attainments, and age groupings, as each of these create differential understanding of even subcultural groups. For example, the contemporary gospel communicator needs to have a good grasp of the subcultures of the ICT-savvy younger generations, the millennials and Gen Z, and those after them, and the social media subculture generally and its mindset in order to be able to communicate with them effectively. Addressing the where question calls for the understanding of the spatial and social location of the community to be reached with the gospel. Even where people share a common ethnic culture, Their spatial and social location imply they are dealing with different existential issues. The issues in an upscale, low-density suburb are different from those of a high-density urban ghetto. These are radically different from those of people living in a remote countryside, hamlet, or ethnic people in diaspora. The when question draws attention to the historical moment in which the gospel is being preached. The abiding flux of life makes it impossible to continue to use past knowledge of a people at the present time. As this study has demonstrated, anthropological studies of the Tiv people of the mid-20th century will not accurately represent the contemporary Tiv people. This is applicable to any people group as well, to other people groups as well. Hitting the why question focalizes the essence of the gospel message. This is where all the elements of the full about definition of contextualization as adapted in this paper will be given adequate attention in view of biblical teaching vis-a-vis the existential situation of the target population. The how question is the point where all of the foregoing comes to a head, where all of that knowledge is harnessed to fashion appropriate strategies, methods, and approaches of consciously, meaningfully, and relevantly presenting the gospel to the target population for a thoroughgoing life transformation. Fourth, the final stage in the process involves the conscious development of an ethno-hermeneutic, a hermeneutical methodology for facilitating the multi-dimensional dialogues that ought to be dynamically going on between the gospel communicator, the biblical text, the church community, through time and contemporarily, and the host culture. This is a call for community theologizing, and it is not something that would be expected to occur within a few years of gospel presence within a pristine community. Rather, it presupposes a certain level of Christian discipleship, the very point where many mission churches in Africa are now. At this stage, then, the emergent local Christian community is engaged by an expert gospel communicator, competent in Christian tradition as well as biblical and cultural exegesis, who would lead focused group-like discussions of the biblical text vis-a-vis cultural norms, customs, and institutions. The gospel communicator serves as a facilitator to provide expert knowledge of the biblical text and Christian worldview, while the community members come to the table as experts in their own culture. In this engagement, they are able to critique their own culture in the light of the biblical teaching, to see elements of it that need to be reinforced or changed, and the best ways of reinforcing or changing them that do no violence to their culture overall. We may call this approach dynamic dialogical community hermeneutics. Conclusion. This study focused on the impact of the methods of the early Christian missionary evangelization and proselytization on native cultures in northern Nigeria, with a particular focus on Tiv people. It has demonstrated that the gross lack of cultural competence amongst the early Western missionaries made them inflict a lot of damages on the culture and psychic of the people, albeit inadvertently. This has been used in assessing appropriate missional methodological approach for the engagement of the gospel and culture. The key issue in the study is that the gospel must be presented in forms that connect with its target audience at heart, without bodily, psychologically, socially, culturally, or environmentally harming them. Steps must be taken to ensure that the gospel is nativized in the culture it reaches without its own soul being lost, and at the same time, selectivity in its mission, exclusively focusing on its heavenly dimension without attending to the this worldly concerns of its target population, must be avoided. Rather, the totality of the metaphysical and existential needs of the individual and the culture it reaches must be addressed, that they may be redeemed and transformed. Thank you.
Actually, we attended the Lausanne Conference. The hottest issue is talking about sexuality. from your presentation, such as kind of traditional right that posted on the young generation. Do you think that Christianity has created vacuum for a while would affect the such a kind of the westernized sexuality, which is now coming to the face of LGBTQ or something in Nigeria as well?
I would say to a degree that that is the case because, like I highlighted, there were cultural norms that guided people even in terms of sexuality. And as they were broken, without that vacuum being filled, people were now exploring diverse ways of expressing their sexuality. And with globalization currently, and the revolution of the mobile phones, whereby even in remote villages, people who have Android phones are able to connect to the whole universe, and they are learning about these things, and without those restraints that culture provided, it has opened up, a can of worms that is eating up societies all over. So I agree.
All right. Then what is the thing that you can fill the gap or the vacuum in your own context as a theologian?
Yeah, I think for many places this will be more like remedial effort because damage has been done. What needs to be done is the work of biblical discipleship, where some of those people get converted. First of all, for many of them, they are in Christendom without really understanding what it means to be a Christian. So they are a mission field in themselves. So they need to be reached with the gospel so that they understand what it means to be Christian, what it means to be born again. It is when this is done that you can begin to disciple them. Take, for example, in my city of Jos, there are some slum areas that they even call them jungles. This is inside the city. And you go there, every kind of vice is going on, from drugs to sex on demand, and perhaps even homosexuality going on there. So there are some people, some of my colleagues, who have decided, the jungles are a mission field, they need to be reached. And one of them had declared 90 days of going into the jungles. They just finished last week. Daily, they were going in, sharing the gospel. And a number of them were accepting the gospel. So the process that will change them is not just that they signed they say the sinner's prayer, but discipleship, like Jesus said in the Great Commission, Matthew 28:19 and 20. So when they are being taught to obey everything, that worldview transformation will give a new lease of life to them.
Thank you for this one.
And maybe let me add
Yes.
something here. Just the other day at Lausanne, I was discussing with a missionary in South Africa, and he was sharing about a culture, a rite of passage that that goes on with some of the ethnic people in South Africa. This is for men. So when young boys reach the age that they will become men, they are taken away. That's when they are circumcised. They don't circumcise them as babies. So when they are like 18, going to 20, thereabout, they go out to this place that they will be for some days. They'll be circumcised, and they will be taught, what it means to be a man and everything. And at the end, the culmination of that rite is for them to have sex with ladies. So it's a big problem for the church. How do you handle this? Because leading them up to that level is again teaching them to obey, what the Bible teaches. So he was telling me they are struggling with that. And I was saying, well, yeah, it's a challenge. But situations like that, we can look back in the history of the church, whereby some customs that were oriented towards pagan, they are taken, the outer shell is taken, but you fill with new content. Like I mentioned in passing, Acts 17, Paul saw, many altars amongst the Greeks, and he saw one. They didn't even know the God. They said, to the unknown God. Whoever that unknown God is, here is your altar. And Paul took that and filled that with new content. This unknown God is Jesus Christ, I came to declare to you. So we see that even in Christian festivals like Christmas. A lot of people look at the pagan roots of it. It was now giving new meaning, celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ. So even the day Sunday was a day for the worship of the sun god, and yet it also coincided with when Jesus resurrected. So rather than people going to worship the sun god, here is the real God we need to worship. So I was encouraging, you need to look at that particular aspect of culture. Maybe the church can create a parallel ceremony of rite of passage where young men in the church will now go, there are old people in the church as well, we now take the responsibility of guiding them through the processes, what it means to be a man. It's not just having many wives, but being loyal to one wife. And at the end of the day, rather than having sex, you are now taught restraint, so that you don't just let go of your emotions. So they must find a way, rather than saying the whole thing is wrong. How can we retain that value of culture but fill it with new meaning?
Thank you so much for that one.
As you were speaking, I tried to identify with some of the issues that you have raised, because there are also some concerns, similar concerns in Ghana. But I see now the problem has become much more complex, in the sense that, yes, Western, probably we say Christianity came with its culture and have destroyed the culture of the indigenous, and we are grappling with it. Maybe we would have said, okay, let us go back to the culture and then pick the things that were good. But now the challenge is that it is not just Western culture, but I will call it technological culture, which has also added up to the problem. So going back to the original culture,
it's not possible.
It's not possible. And dealing with just the trying to handle the Western culture through contextualization has become much more complex because of technology. Now, in terms in the sexual issues that you mentioned, with the puberty rights, we have that also, and we've been discussing how can we bring this back. Now, there is a discipleship program, we call it the catechism studies, that one has to go through from age 12 to 18. And so this would somehow help, we believe, to solve the problem when we are able to take the cultural aspect of it, because the puberty right also comes with it good things. But like you mentioned, the spiritual aspect of it, for instance, the shell that is put on the girl, with that spiritual aspect, well, the church can work on that. But now we live in a technological age where even the young girls, let me put it that way, have no time for discipleship programs of the church, because education takes much of the time. How do we handle this complexity?
Okay, thank you. Well, I truly appreciate what you are saying. I think sometimes some of this come from the values in the home. Part of what we need to do as ministers is to teach families to to treasure their family life and their children above other things. Two things I would say. First of all is the place of the family altar. Maintaining a family altar time, devotional time of worship as a family on a daily basis is very important. We know what I think Proverbs 18, is it 26? That says, train up a child, verse 6 rather, train up the child the way he should go. When he grows, he will not depart from it. And it starts from the home. So we need, as Christian families, to be committed to that, so that daily there's a time we set apart that this is time for God. When that is done, it will take care of a lot of issues. Secondly, we are in a very competitive world. This is not just in Africa, it's all over. My travels in China and other places, and even from here in Korea, from what I hear, there's that competitiveness. We want to be the best. And in the drive to that, sometimes we neglect the more important things. Jesus had asked a very fundamental question. What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? That's a question we should always have at the back of our minds as we deal with things like this. Because if we want our children to excel in education, or we neglect their spiritual life, we are denying them something very fundamental. So going for that catechism, unless if you go every day in a week, if it's not every day in a week, if it's once a week, like when I was young we used to go, will not in any way deprive you from becoming the best student. And I remember from my own experience, when I came to know the Lord, I had absolute commitment. In college, I was one of the leaders. I became the president of the fellowship, which was almost like being a pastor. And yet at the same time, with a busy schedule, even in my department, I was involved with the student activity. I even became the national president of a departmental association. And yet, I still, with discipline, I had a strict schedule of my own personal studies. I knew the time I'm giving to fellowship, the time I'm giving to departmental association, but I budgeted time that I must study. Again, these are things that we need to teach children right from early, that you have to be conscientious about how you use your time. Time management is critical. If we do that very well, then there will be enough room for discipleship and for proper training. So two things: family altar, they see from mommy and daddy right from when they're young that commitment of a reserving time for you and God. And then appropriate teaching of setting of priorities, what should be priority and how you allocate time to them. If you do that, you'll be able to take them to the catechism and other discipleship programs without neglecting their studies.
My question has to do with culture. And I must admit that one of the things that I've really appreciated having joined AIGS University is the value of culture.
Multicultural
to appreciate culture. A lot of emphasis. Prior to my coming to this school, myself and many others from my setup, we were running out from our culture. I never dressed in my cultural dress because from where I come from, it's not for Christians. So there are so many, of course, bad things about the culture, but there are also so many other good things about the culture which I'm now appreciating. But we had a blanket dismissal of everything cultural. So there's a wide drift between Christians and Africans who are not necessarily Christians. I come from a culture that is pretty much, I would say, practices Judaism, including animal sacrifices, including circumcision. So when I'm in my village, I ought to behave differently than when I'm in the city. In the city, I'm appreciated because of being educated, being able to preach, being able to serve. But when I go back to the village, I'm not even competent enough to run to be the head of a cattle beat. because there are some cultural things I do not partake in. And we are finding ourselves caught in between because in as much as we are running away from the culture, perhaps which we should not, there are some aspects of the culture that we are forced to partake in. For example, before we marry, we do a church wedding. As a prerequisite, there are some cultural steps, very elaborate cultural steps that must be taken. Sometimes we feel guilty about it, but now there are those things I feel we need to appreciate. I want to find out from you, how do we distinguish between what is syncretism and what is positive about our culture? Because the more we learn out from the culture, the more we look foreign to our own people. And the more we go back to our culture, again, the more we learn away from Jesus, because my culture is so anti-Jesus. We are for God, yes, God the Father, but the more we preach Jesus, they find it very difficult to be concerned with incarnation. It doesn't occur in their mind. That's the first question. Question number 2 is, I recently attended a forum where contextualization was, to some extent, demeaned, in the sense that missionaries were not missional to Africa. They didn't bring theology in a sense that Africans can take theology outside as mission. And they are proposing a move from contextualization. The contextualization is coming from, before contextualization, we thought that was indigenization, then it gave birth to contextualization. And now the proposal is to move from contextualization to contextization to prepare Africans to be able to take theology or gospel to the outside world. I don't know what your view on that is.
Well, let me begin from that last one. I think sometimes people want to create new terminology for the sake of it because contextualization does not limit itself to Africa. The key word there, the root word there is context. And the liization basically is saying you should operate within the context of that particular situation. So it doesn't matter where you are. So, for example, I talked about how Korea now is the second largest nation sending missionaries abroad. And there are Korean missionaries all over the world. When I was in seminary, I was taught by a Korean missionary. I'm going to spend my last 3 days here with his family. Yeah, and so if he came from Korea to Nigeria, he needed to understand Nigerian culture in order to be relevant. And Nigerians are also going as missionaries to different parts of the world. Some years ago, I was in Scotland, and I visited someone. We were in college about the same time, and he is in a Pentecostal church. He's a pastor in Scotland. And I was asking him, how many Scottish people are in your church? And he was giving excuses. His church is this kind of churches that do a lot of fasting, 40 days fasting, and all those kind of things. And so he said, well, some of them started coming, but, they are not oriented to this hard life, and they moved back. I said, no, you're not doing it right. You are operating like a synagogue. First century Jews went everywhere. They carried the synagogue. And if you are a Roman or Ethiopian, you want to join, you have to become a Jew. And that's what you are doing. You left Nigeria, you are here in Scotland. And you want Scottish people who have never been to Nigeria to start acting like Nigerians? That's the very thing we are accusing Western missionaries of. You are doing the reverse. You need to understand the mindset of the Scots and relate to them at that level. And then you can bring the gospel to where they are. So it's not the change of the term. contextualization is still relevant. Whether you are moving from India as a missionary to Wales, you will still not carry your Indian culture to Wales. You need to understand what the Welsh people are, their culture, and how to relate to them. That's contextualization. So let's not get caught up in terminology, but what is the substance of what you need to do? In terms of the challenge of your culture, I can identify with that. I grew up, my granddad was a tribal chief, so I grew up with that environment of understanding the traditional worship and all the systems, and much more than even some people who are older than me, because I was living in the palace with my granddad and saw everything. And so as changes were happening, one thing I would suggest is not to give up on the village and run away to the city. Is to still go back. One of the key things, in traditional societies, a lot of times when you are doing evangelism, an older person may like it, but he say, well, my time is past. I'm committed to our ancestral things. Go and talk to the young people. But if you are able to win an old person, you are winning many people. When my own father became a believer, many years after, in fact, when I had left my professional practice, I was trained in the engineering field, practiced for about 7 years when I got a call and left. In circumstances that were very difficult because of all my father's children, I was the one that was helping them financially. And giving up my professional practice for mission work in an evangelical setting where you are not paid a living wage was a trying time for them. And yet it was within that context that both my mother and my father came to know the Lord. And my father knew the Lord when he was late 60s and shortly into his 70s. And, with very low life expectancy, he was one of the older people in the community. And so he became a big evangelist. And by the time he's speaking, everybody will keep quiet. Eventually, he became an itinerant preacher, of kind of like the Methodist circuit preacher for a Pentecostal church, overseeing 3 rural churches when he was in his 70s going to 80. So at that age, by the time he is speaking, everybody will listen. If his culture, he knows it. And he was part of those that began to shift some of those cultural things. I will give you an example. Amongst the Tiv people, traditionally it was believed that nobody just died. Somebody must kill somebody. So, if somebody dies, after burial, they will now have to sit and do an inquisition as to who killed the person. I'm sure other Africans can relate to that. And part of that burial process was that when the burial is finished, all the wives, people from where their father's home that came, say, we are going with our daughter and all her children. And as they will carry them to go, there has to be an elder who will now say, no, give them to me, I'm responsible for protecting them. So when my father became a believer and my elder brother died, and as people came, beginning with my late brother's family, they were going to ask that they want to go with their daughter and the children. My father said, no. He is a Christian now. He knows it's God that protects people. No human being can protect anyone. So he's not going to do that. And all my extended family rose up against my father. How can you dare to say it? My father said, this is his house. And he's a believer, and his children, and those kind of things, they are not doing it. And it was tough for people. But right now, in my community, nobody does that again because my father dared to stand up. So when they come, rather than say, we want to go with our people, they will only call the wife, their daughter and the children and just bless them and go. Nobody say we want to go and see who will be held responsible for protecting them. So getting old people to come to faith and to understand the gospel and know the distinction between culture, those things that are cultural that need to be valued, my father still held to them, such that in the traditional council, they always sought his counsel on issues. But when it came to things that were demeaning to the gospel, he would make his stand. So like even the issue of that rite of washing of a virgin, it's not practiced again that way, where they will actually go and perform the rites, but there will be something that will still come in the name of, it will not be called the goat for the single spirit that was watching over the virgins, but a price for the care of the girl. So it's not taken away, something is given, but it's a different name to give the mother for taking care of the girl, rather than giving it for the spirit that was watching over her virginity. It's substitution, exactly. Rather than the spirit is the mother that is honored. So you see, so there are those things that can come, but you as a younger person trying to project that, it will be more difficult. But when you have older people coming to faith and they believe the gospel and they are made to understand the Bible, they will speak from the strength, the wealth of their knowledge of the culture and the respect that they have for their age. Initially, there will be a pushback. Like when my father started some of those things, there was a pushback, but he stood firm. And now the larger community is following what he started.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I've raised up in very extreme Islamic culture. So you probably know that in Islamic culture, they teach their children about sexual education and all this. But in Christianity, that we lack somewhere regarding this topic. And what do you think when it comes on congregation, what ways church should adapt it to educate sexually to the Christian youth through biblical perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's an area in which the church is doing very badly. Let me give you an anecdote here to illustrate this. A mother who was trying to caution the daughter, and without really going into sex education, he said, look, don't ever let any man see your underwear. And she kept saying that. Anyway, the girl went to school, and then, she got pregnant. So she came back home, and the mother started asking, didn't I tell you, don't let any man see your underwear? Says, yeah, mommy, I hid my underwear.
Misinterpretation.
Exactly. She was not explicit enough. And so that is missing. Again, for me, I would say it starts at home. And when my daughter was getting a bit older, from about 8 and 9, 10, I realized that my wife wasn't going to teach her anything. Maybe she would tell her, don't allow any man to see your underwear. I began in appropriate way. At each stage in her age, I knew what to tell her with regards to her sexuality. Even when she got to the point where she would start having menses, I was the one that was teaching her what to expect. And so, with that kind of orientation, there's nothing somebody will go and tell her outside. So, as a church, we need to, again, educate parents how to provide that education. But also, some of the youth programs that we do, there could be appropriate ways that some of this could be taught so that our youth are not taken by surprise by anything.
My question is that if the Bible teaching is contradict with the cultural belief, should we change the Bible teaching? Like the dating culture, homosexuality, LGBTQ. Like what should be our stance as a minister in the church?
Okay. I think that's a very easy question to answer. From the lecture, talking about changing the Bible to suit the culture sounds more like inculturation that the Catholics practice, whereby they say Christ is already in the culture. But we Protestants say, no, Christ, the knowledge of Christ may have precursors in the culture, but he's not in the culture. So when he comes to culture, he comes to transform culture, just like he transforms our lives as individuals. So there are some things about us as individuals that are good. You know, some people, they are very intelligent. Some people, they relate very easily with others. Those are good things. And even when you become a believer, you use them. But there are traits. If somebody is a liar, somebody is a thief, they have to change. The same applies to culture. So there are good things in culture that need to be emphasized, and there are bad aspects of culture that need to be redeemed. So, there are evangelicals today that are capitulating to the general culture. For example, in the area of LGBT, and people do rigmarole with their Bible interpretation to make room for that. And this is something that the Bible is very clear about. So those are places that we can never compromise. So where, culture comes short of biblical teaching, we need to make a firm stand so that we don't subvert the gospel.
I will go through the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned in your conclusion that it's focused your paper to impact of the methods of the early Christian missionary evangelization. And my question is, I want to have more clarification about your whole paper when it comes to the application, not just only for Nigeria, but looking forward in the big picture of,
Globally.
Globally.
Yes. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. If you follow through, the section on whether contextualization, part of what I said is that my proposal is hermeneutical. What are those approaches that we can use which are universal, not just within the TIF culture? And so the various stages that I outlined there, number 1 to 4, number 3 had some subsections. So I believe if you take time and study that section very well, you understand it, then that's where you see that the issues that are being raised will be addressed. Maybe let me just make a quick reference to illustrate what I'm saying so that you will get me well. I'm sure your page numbers are different from mine, but if you look at the subheading of whether contextualization, so from that section, there's an outline of different things. The second paragraph begins, first, contextualization must be understood clearly. And I discuss how those issues will be looked at. First of all, I highlighted the importance of sharing the gospel. Somebody is converted, they are discipled, and they are part of the church. And through this, the church is proclaiming the whole gospel to the total individual and all the challenges they faced. Then the second aspect talks about the duality of contextuality, whereby the gospel takes incarnate into the culture and yet is still redeeming culture. So let me not repeat myself, but just read that section from there to just before conclusion. There are different things that I outlined that if we take this step, whether we are from Ethiopia, we are going to South Africa, or we are from South Africa, we are going to Norway, we still have to apply the same principles contextually, and we will be at least approaching a situation where we will not be harming the culture or harming the gospel, but bringing them into a synergy that is transformative.